Hey friends, tonight we're keeping it slow, gentle, and a little bit nosy about the past. If you're settling in, dim the lights, find a blanket, and let your shoulders drop. If you want to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now, I love hearing that. It never stops being quietly amazing that people drift off to the same story from so many corners of the world. You might be thinking this is just another mystery about missing treasure and men in white cloaks. That's fair. But the real Templar story is less about a secret vault and more about a very medieval idea that got a bit out of control. It grew into an international network of war, money, and paperwork wrapped in vows and very persuasive PR. We'll move through it without drama, no jump scares, just the strange comfort of people being very human in a world that didn't make things easy. Let's set the scene. It's 1095, Clermont in France. Pope Urban II is addressing a crowd big enough to make the local market jealous. He calls for a crusade to liberate Jerusalem. The phrase, "God wills it," does a lot of heavy lifting. Knights head east because how do you say no when the Pope offers spiritual benefits and a better storyline than lingering at home arguing about hedges? A few decades later, after the First Crusade carved out fragile states in the Levant, the region is busy and dangerous. Pilgrims want to visit holy sites. Bandits also want to visit pilgrims. Enter a French knight named Hugues de Pance. In 1119, according to later accounts, he and 8 companions ask King Baldwin II of Jerusalem for permission to protect travelers on the roads. They get quarters near the Temple Mount. People start calling them the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It's a mouthful. Templars was easier. Now, the origin story has a certain shine. 9 knights, 9 years, humble beginnings, sacred address. It's tidy. Medieval narratives liked tidy. The reality was probably messier. Hugues wasn't drifting around the East alone. He was connected to serious power back home. He had ties to the Count of Champagne, rich, influential, and very interested in the crusading project, and to Bernard of Clairvaux, who will show up in a minute to do for Templar branding what a modern agency does for a sneaker launch. Only, with more theology and fewer billboards.
For a while, the Templars are a small presence with a practical mission. Roads, bandits, sharp elbows, but it doesn't stay small. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the order gets a formal rule, a habit, and serious legitimacy. This is where Bernard, the Cistercian abbot, comes in with his famous treatise in praise of the new knighthood. Bernard had a gift for taking contradictions and making them sound sensible. Christianity says, turn the other cheek. Knights say, please hand me my lance. Bernard says, all right, but what if you fight sin itself? He gives them a spiritual lane to do martial work and still look like they're pointed at heaven. If you've ever watched someone turn a potential PR disaster into a mission statement, you get the energy. The rule itself is oddly charming. It bans ridiculous clothing, shiny belts, and elaborate hair. No hunting birds or dogs. Meals are simple. Conversation is to be modest. You sleep in your armor when needed, because of course you do. The point is discipline, and the vows – poverty, chastity, obedience – tie it all together with a bow made of renunciation. On paper, it's humility. In practice, it's structure. One rule, thousands of men, far-flung houses that all theoretically behave like one disciplined mind. It's not just morals, it's management. The white mantle with the red cross appears as a symbol of this identity. It's visual theology. White for purity, red for martyrdom. You can see a Templar from a long way off. Very helpful in a world where most knights don't wear team jerseys. And money starts to flow. Nobles donate lands. Kings give privileges. Papal bulls grant exemptions. Omne datum optimum in 1139 is a big one. It frees the order from local church control and puts it directly under papal authority. That is a golden ticket in medieval Europe. It means bishops can't boss you around. Secular lords can't tax you easily. If anyone asks questions, you just say, "The Pope is our manager." It's not subtle. It works. Templar commanderies, those local houses, sprout up across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. They serve multiple functions: recruiting stations, training bases, farms that actually feed people, stables for war horses, administrative offices, and, quietly, financial hubs. If you're a pilgrim in Paris, you can deposit funds with the Templars and withdraw them in a year. You don't have to carry a bag of coins through bandit country. Letters of credit solve problems. The order doesn't invent every financial instrument at once, but it develops a lot of them quickly: secure deposits, transfers, standardized receipts, trusted seals. It's logistics applied to money.
The irony writes itself. They vow poverty, they become custodians of other people's wealth. Individual brothers own nothing. The order owns a great deal. If that feels like a loophole big enough to ride a war horse through, you're not wrong. Medieval people weren't allergic to contradictions. They were connoisseurs of them. On the battlefield, Templars are famous for courage that reads, depending on your angle, as either admirable discipline or terrifying stubbornness. There are rules for charging, for retreating or not retreating, for keeping the line. The order is tough, but it's not invincible. Crusader states have a habit of being isolated, undersupplied, and politically messy. Cooperation with other orders like the Hospitallers is strategic, but they also bicker like siblings who share a room and a sword rack. Meanwhile, Bernard of Clairvaux continues to hype them. He's no softy. He drives himself and others hard. His health is a disaster. Fasting as a hobby. Zero tolerance for comfort. He would have gotten along well with modern productivity influencers, except his to-do list includes reform the church and rescue crusading from its own contradictions. How relaxing. As the 12th century rolls on, donations keep coming, the order learns to manage estates from Scotland to Sicily. They develop standardized practices that make their network more predictable than the typical feudal household, where management can mean my cousin shows up twice a year and demands rent and chickens. The Templar method is more boring than that, which is exactly why it works. Boring is power. It lets you plan. In the East, the story bends toward loss. Muslim polities adapt, unify, and push back. Crusader outposts get squeezed. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 tells its own story. The fall of Acre in 1291 basically ends the Latin states in the Levant. The Templars shift to Cyprus and continue to plan for a return that never really comes. The mission drifts, the expenses don't. People notice.
Inside Europe, kings are starting to feel more like modern states and less like well-armed landlords. They want revenue streams that behave. They want advisors who can count. They want to put their stamp on everything. But they also keep needing loans. And who do you go to in a pinch? The people who've built Europe's most reliable network of funds, careers, and strong rooms. The Templars. Which brings us to Philip IV of France. Philip the Fair. Fair as in handsome, not as in justice. His cheekbones are doing more work than his balance sheets. He reigns from 1285 to 1314 and spends a lot of time broke, which he solves with the grace of a bored cat tipping cups off a table. He fights expensive wars. He taxes clergy, which does not endear him to popes. He debases currency. The public riots because bread doesn't care about royal excuses. He expels the Jews from France in 1306, seizing assets and shattering communities to plug budget holes. It's cruelty presented as policy. He also goes after the Lombard bankers. If you had money, Philip had an idea for it. It usually involved, give it to me. When he tries to yank on church finances, he ends up in a messy showdown with Pope Boniface VIII. That ends with an infamous assault at Anagni in 1303, where royal agents humiliate the Pope. Boniface dies shortly after. You can call it ugly realpolitik. You can also call it an escalation of I don't answer to you energy. Philip wants a manageable papacy. He gets one. Clement V is French. The papal court moves to Avignon. It's not exactly Paris, but it's not exactly Rome either. People will call it the Babylonian captivity of the papacy because medieval people also enjoyed dramatic labels. So now picture France around 1305 to 1307. The king is surrounded by clever administrators. Guillaume de Nogaret stands out. He does the quiet work of making things legal that wouldn't pass a sniff test in sunlight. Philip owes money to the Templars. He doesn't like owing. He doesn't like rivals. And he really doesn't like organizations that don't answer to him. The Templars fit every category. Meanwhile, the Templar headquarters in Paris, the Temple, sits there with its walls, its vaults, and its aura of "we can outlast your temper tantrum." The order is a papal institution. It is exempt from local interference, and it is sitting next to a king who has run out of patience. Add one more ingredient: disappointment. The Templars' original purpose was tied to the Holy Land. The Holy Land is not in Christian hands. People start asking what exactly the order is doing other than wearing nice white cloaks and balancing ledgers. Which is a bit unfair, given they also maintain roads, guard trade, and run legit charitable work. But fairness is not trending. In this climate, rumors do the rounds. Some come from enemies, some from failed applicants or disgruntled ex-members. Esquidif Laurent, a name that sounds like he should be writing poetry but isn't, gives testimony about Templar initiation rituals that would get attention anywhere. He says there are secret denials of Christ, spitting on the cross, kisses in unfortunate places, and an idol with a strange name, Baphomet, becomes the headline. The charges are scandalous enough to be sticky. Are they true? There's no solid evidence that they were typical or theological. Under pressure and torture, people will say what they must. But in 1307, true is not the point. Plausible is more than enough. Philip sees an opening. He can pose as defender of the faith and solve a fiscal problem at the same time. Elegant, in a bleak way, he moves fast. He uses the Inquisition's tools, the secrecy of sealed orders, and the king's bureaucratic reach. He also needs the Pope to play along, or at least not play against him. Clement V hesitates, presses for church-led inquiry, and then gets dragged by events. Before we get to the famous Friday, let's take a quiet walk through a Templar day, because it helps to remember these were real people with routines and small frustrations. A brother rises before dawn for prayer. In a house in Normandy and Portugal, in Apulia, the rhythm is similar. Meals are simple. Meat on assigned days, silence at certain times, horses dressed, tack checked, letters sealed with wax and the Red Cross, ledgers updated in a neat hand. A novice learns the rules. Keep your beard trimmed. Keep your temper trimmed more. Don't beg for better food. Don't show off with fancy gear. The order's strength isn't in a few heroes. It's in the gears turning steadily. They weren't ascetics in caves. They were managers, quartermasters, writers, scribes, farriers, and yes, fighters. They had a reputation for charging as a group and not breaking formation easily. The word fanatic gets tossed around. It's not quite fair. They were professionals. They had rules about when to chase and when to hold. They also had a reputation for dying in place rather than retreating if their standard fell. That's either inspiration or poor risk assessment. Depends on your threshold for heroism. By the late 13th century, the order's status in Europe makes for complicated relationships. Templar houses are neutral ground in many disputes. They store charters, they hold keys, they run guest houses, they loan to kings and merchants at fees just this side of usury, because everyone knows the rules and how to write around them. You drop a deposit in London and pick it up in Acre because you have a note with the right ink and seal. It is, in a way, trust turned into paper, then back into coin. We often imagine medieval Europe as wildly chaotic. It could be, but organizations like the Templars were engines of predictability. That's why they were valuable. Also why they were resented. It's hard to love the person who keeps reminding you you're overdrawn. Let's float back to Paris in October 1307. Sealed orders go out to royal officials across France. Heads of households open them on the same morning. It is, logistically, impressive.
also cold-blooded. At dawn on Friday the 13th, the arrests begin. That date gets a lot of later myth attached to it. The reality is less spooky and more administrative. Men wake to soldiers at the door, accounts are seized, keys taken. The temple is emptied of people who never quite thought the king would dare it. They had a papal seal on their exemptions. That used to mean something. We'll move through the arrests and the trials in our next stretch, calmly and without lurid detail. There will be torture. There will be confessions that contradict each other so thoroughly it's almost a grim kind of comedy. There will be politics dressed up as piety. And amidst it all, there will be individuals making small, human decisions that ripple out for centuries. Before we end tonight's chapter, a gentle note about legends. You'll hear about a vanished fleet at La Rochelle. You'll hear about an idol with a strange face. You'll hear about a curse pronounced in flames that carried off a pope and a king. Some of these stories are born from the theater of power, some from later needs for drama, some from real gaps in the record that invite creative stitching. We'll keep our feet on the ground. We'll say maybe when the evidence says maybe. We'll say no when the evidence says no. And we'll give a tired half-smile when medieval propaganda still does its job 700 years later.
The Templars began as an idea, piety with a sword and a ledger. That idea took on stone and horses and habits. It became a network that connected sheep farms in England to fortresses in Syria and parish donors in Burgundy to a dusty road near Jerusalem. It accumulated land, people, and prestige. It also accumulated enemies. It's not dramatic to say that the Order's strengths and the Order's vulnerabilities were the same thing: visibility, independence, and a helpful habit of saying, "We answer to the Pope, not to you." In a world turning toward stronger kings and Renaissance states, that was never going to end quietly. Take a breath. Let your jaw unclench. We'll ease into the arrests, the interrogations, and the slow unspooling of an institution in Part 2. No rushing, no cliffhangers, just the steady turning of the wheel.
Welcome back. Get comfortable. Shoulders loose, jaw unclenched. If your tea is still warm, take a sip. If it's gone cold, that's very on brand for medieval history. It tends to cool everything down. We left off at dawn, Paris, Friday the 13th of October, 1307. The city is still groggy. Bakers are getting fires going, cats are minding their own mysterious business, and royal officers are opening sealed orders in quiet rooms with good locks. The instructions are simple enough that even an anxious bureaucrat can't mess them up. Arrest the Templars, all of them, today. Across France, doors get hammered at, keys change pockets. Brothers in white mantles wake to steal at the bedside. They believe, at first, it's a misunderstanding. They answer to the Pope, everyone knows that. You can't just, well, actually you can, if you're a king whose patience has expired and whose accountants have stopped pretending the numbers add up. The Paris Temple, one of the grandest commandery complexes in Europe, is a fortified sanctuary. But this isn't a siege. It's paperwork backed by force. The brothers cooperate. Most do not reach for swords. They believe the law will sort it out. They've spent 2 centuries being told the law is on their side. It's a rough way to find out that the law is now a moving target. Inventories are taken. You might imagine glittering piles of coin. The reality is less cinematic. There are account books, bonds, deposits, promissory notes, bags of coin from different mints, and a lot of property that looks like responsibility. Grain, blankets, tack, tools. Medieval wealth is unsexy that way. It lives in land and rights, in mill streams and rents, in IOUs with seals from people who are used to getting what they want. The famous missing treasure will be a story that flourishes in the gaps between expectation and ledgers. It's not that nothing was there, it's that it didn't sparkle.
The charges are announced with a tone of righteous horror that does not quite hide the choreography. Heresy, blasphemy, secret rituals. There's talk of a head-shaped idol, There's talk of spitting on the cross during initiation, of forced denials of Christ to test obedience, of indecent kisses that sound like the accusations a nervous imagination makes when it can't peek behind a curtain. Baphomet is the name that sticks, probably a scribal slur of Muhammad, which tells you more about the accuser's worldview than the Templars' theology. It's designed to shock an audience already primed to see scandal. And then come the interrogations, slowly at first, then fast. If you're looking for comfort in this part of the story, there isn't much. We won't linger on techniques. The strappado shows up, and other methods that make men agree with anything. Torture produces confessions the way a fountain produces water. It's not a reliable source of truth, but it is very good at producing words. The confessions do what confessions always do under pressure: contradict each other. Some men admit to something like a ritual denial of Christ at initiation. Others say they never saw it. Some describe a head, or a cat, or a bearded face, or something seen once by someone else in a different place on a stormy night. The contradictions should have derailed the whole thing. They don't, because the point is not proof. The point is momentum. King Philip's ministers, Guillaume de Nogaret among them, understand momentum. He's the kind of administrator who will look at a moral quandary and ask calmly how many seals it requires. He has already shown how far he'll push the limits by orchestrating the humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII a few years earlier. He's not squeamish. He is also not immortal. He dies in 1313 before he can watch his project complete itself. It's probably the one thing he misses. Pope Clement V watches this French project with the look of a man who has inherited a problem and then been loaned two more. He's French. He owes his position to Philip's help. He has moved the papacy to Avignon, a comfortable address with unfortunate optics. He wants to control the investigation. He does not want to rubber stamp a king's grudge. He also doesn't want to pick a fight he can't win.
First, he tries to steer. In late 1307, his bull Pastoralis Preeminentiae instructs Christian rulers to arrest Templars and seize their property for the church. Note that word, for the church, not for kings. It's the papal way of saying, fine, we'll handle this. You monarchs, bring them to us. This spreads the dragnet across Europe, but it has an unintended benefit. It also spreads out the legal process into different jurisdictions with different customs and different appetites for cruelty. The trials won't look the same everywhere. England is a good example of the slow version. Edward II initially resists. He writes, somewhat testily, that he doesn't believe the accusations. He will eventually comply, but English investigations are more procedural and less theatrical. Torture, where allowed, is limited. Some brothers confess, many do not. Pensions and quiet retirements begin to look like the solution. If you wanted to bury a scandal with minimal fuss, the English approach is the template. In the Crown of Aragon and the kingdoms of Castile and Leon, monarchs have their own uses for men with swords and ledgers. They're still fighting on shifting frontiers. Trials do happen. Assets are seized, but the violence is less concentrated. Several brothers will be absorbed into other orders. In Portugal, King Dinas takes a particularly practical route. The Order of Christ will be founded in 1319, and with papal approval, it will receive Templar assets. New name, same buildings, much of the same personnel. It's a medieval version of under new management that mostly means under a new logo. In the German lands, things are even less uniform. Some church courts acquit brothers. Others keep the process going long enough for the news cycle to move on, medievally speaking. The Holy Roman Empire is a quilt of jurisdictions, stitched together by negotiations and habits. Habits here include not letting the French crown set your schedule. Back in France, the process is more direct. French inquisitors collect confessions. The royal government limits papal access to prisoners. When papal commissioners do get to question high-ranking Templars in 1308 in Chinon, a striking thing happens.
The men, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, are privately questioned. They admit to some irregularities, the sort of thing a frightened man will say to save his life, but crucially, Clement's commissioners absolve them of heresy. This record, known today as the Chinon Parchment, sat lost in the Vatican secret archives until the early 21st century because medieval history enjoys misplacing its receipts.
The Chinon absolutions don't save the order. Politics outruns paperwork. Public pressure is real. Philip controls the stage in France. Clement, if he resists too openly, risks an encore of Anani. The Pope convenes a general council at Vienne in 1311. Bishops gather. Arguments are heard. Not everyone is convinced the order is heretical. Many are not impressed with the French case. There is talk of reforming the Templars, merging them, redirecting them to other tasks. But the climate is smoky with scandal. The simplest way to end the strain is to dissolve the order. Not because it's proved heretical in doctrine, but because the scandal has made it impossible to continue. In 1312, Clement issues Vox in Excelso. The Knights Templar are suppressed by apostolic ordinance, which is papal code for, "We are shutting this down for the sake of peace." Another bull, Ad Providam, handles the property. On paper, Templar assets are transferred to the Hospital of St. John, the Hospitallers. In practice, a lot of hands get a taste. The French crown, for instance, will extract expenses. Some assets are already tangled in local claims. The transfer takes years. By then, some properties are declining. Others are simply not the gold mines people expect. Monasteries do not turn instant profit. Neither do farms, mills, and rural estates with tenants who have opinions and goats. Before the council's decisions and after, the trials grind on. In 1310, a group of Templars in Paris retract their earlier confessions. They declare their innocence and that of the order. They expect, perhaps, that the Church will hear them out. Instead, they are declared relapsed heretics, the medieval legal category that says, you confessed, then recanted, therefore you are now worse. And 54 men are burned outside Paris. The fire is meant to be a message, not to the world, which already knows how this is going, but to any remaining brothers who consider changing their story when the Church, not the Crown, finally holds formal hearings. It's a clear, if brutal, instruction: do not make this harder. Jacques de Molay waits out much of this slow disaster in prison. He's older than the stereotype. Not the shining young knight, but a weathered administrator who has seen the Levant and the inside of a ledger. Whatever the order might have been 2 generations earlier, by 1307 it is a complicated machine. He has tried to hold it together through the fall of the Crusader states, through the consolidation on Cyprus, through the erosion of their original reason for existing. He gets drawn into the French king's theater, then into the papal machinery, and back again. On March 18, 1314, a public stage is set in Paris, on the Parvis of Notre Dame. The sentence for the last 4 high officers is prepared: life imprisonment. It's humiliating, but it's not fatal. The plan is to display submission, then close the book. The crowd gathers. Church officials assemble to read the prepared words. This is the moment the script goes sideways.
De Molay and Geoffroy de Chagny, the preceptor of Normandy, step forward and declare that their confessions were false. They assert the order's innocence. They would rather die than live with a lie. The words are simple. The effect is not. The schedule shreds itself. Philip is not a man who enjoys improvisation. The 2 are condemned on the spot as relapsed heretics and burned that evening on a small island in the Seine across from the royal garden. There's no final appeal, no further inquiry. The fire is fast. It's also final. A legend grows almost immediately, because of course it does. It says the Grand Master, in the flames, summoned Pope Clement and King Philip before God's tribunal within a year. The medieval public loves a neat arc. Clement dies a month later, sick and exhausted, in April 1314. Philip dies in November, after a hunting accident. People nod gravely and do that face. The curse becomes part of the folklore you can't kill with a papal bull. Within the next generation, Philip's 3 sons, Louis X, Philip V, Charles IV, will all die without male heirs, and the direct Capetian line fails. Does that prove anything beyond the fragility of medieval biology? Not really.
But if you're looking for symmetry, the 14th century will provide it with a smirk. While France burns men, other realms take other paths. In England, many brothers are examined, admonished, and pensioned off. In Iberia, the Order of Christ and other redirections keep expertise intact with new banners. In Germany, a mix of acquittals and bureaucratic inertia saves more lives than rhetoric does. The Hospitallers absorb a lot of property in name. In practice, the transfer is a patchwork. We should pause here and look, just for a minute, at what an initiation might have looked like without the overlay of fear. You are a knight candidate, kneeling in a small chapel. The brothers are gathered. You promise to live in obedience, to hold no property of your own, to be chaste, and to fight for the church. The master asks if you have any debts, any obligations that would interfere, any illnesses that would make the life impossible. The questions are practical. The tone is stern, but not cruel. There is a kiss of peace. There is a mantle placed on your shoulders. It's not a carnival. It's a serious moment in a serious place. Now overlay torture, pain, and the desire to please captors, and you can see how the trial record becomes a funhouse mirror, familiar shapes bending into grotesques. Let's also step quietly into a commandery after the arrests in a country where the pace is slower. The garden still needs tending, horses still need care, a steward checks storehouses. The prior, now a former Templar in all but habit, negotiates with a local official about rents. A messenger brings a papal order. The seal is there, the ink is faded but legible. Surrender properties to the hospital. The men obey. Some switch mantles. A new cross goes on a familiar cloak. It feels to the men who stay like a haircut after a long illness. You're still yourself, but you're also not.
As for the idol, the head, the cat, the finger bone in a box labeled relic and hidden under a bench, medieval religious life is full of objects. Saints' bones circulate like spiritual currency. Pieces of the true cross would, if piled together, build a sturdy ship. Claims get exaggerated. Some are outright lies. Some are sincere, but wrong. A secret head in Templar custody isn't impossible, but it's far more likely to be a relic with bad press than a demonic statue with a cult following. For the record, no such head was ever produced for a court with providence that made sense. The trial shows a lot of inventive swearing. It shows very little evidence. And the treasure. The famous fleet at La Rochelle, loaded in the night, vanishing into the Atlantic mist. It's a great image. Shame about the sources. Contemporary records don't mention a standing Templar navy in that port in 1307. Could ships have sailed with valuables? Yes. Could some funds and documents have been shuffled into friendly hands ahead of the raids? Also yes. Competent administrators anticipate trouble. But the fleet, as a capital F fact, belongs to a later century's hobby of drawing straight lines between dots that were never connected. The reality is quietly interesting enough. In the months before the arrests, there are hints that some goods moved, that some correspondence was burned or hidden, that some brothers found excuses to travel. A treasurer would be the kind of man who keeps 2 sets of keys and knows which chest to empty first. There's nothing magical about prudence. It's not as exciting as a secret cave full of gold. It's much more in character for an order that managed grain tallies like a religion. The men behind this story are not mythic figures. They get headaches, they miss home, they argue about fodder. Jacques de Molay is not Achilles. He's a manager with a past, forced to be a martyr by a system that had no use for his skill set anymore. Guillaume de Nogaret is not Mephistopheles. He's a lawyer with a talent for making rules bend. Pope Clement is not a villain so much as a trapped man, pulled between loyalties, with a body that keeps giving up at inconvenient times. Philip the Fair is not a cartoon tyrant. He's a king with fiscal problems, who chooses the bluntest solutions every time and gets rewarded just enough to keep going until his luck ends in a forest.
And, because we are here for the human threads, a soft glance at Enguerrand de Marigny, Philip's powerful minister after Nogaret, who helps tighten the fiscal screws, extracts assets, and centralize authority. After Philip dies, Enguerrand is accused of sorcery and corruption by rivals and hanged in 1315. It's not justice, it's politics doing what politics does when the patron is gone. If you wanted a miniature of the Templar story, useful, powerful, then suddenly inconvenient, you could do worse than Enguerrand on his gallows, watching the wind pay no attention.
A few practical consequences. The Hospitallers become wealthier, at least on parchment. They also inherit headaches. They are not the same kind of order, but they learn from Templar logistics. Their maritime turn accelerates. Within decades, they will be a naval power from Rhodes, then Malta, with a red cross you can see from a mile. The French crown gets flows of ready cash, yes, but also triggers a chill in credit relations. If you're a banker and a king seizes a rival institution's assets on a moral pretext, you start to ask hard questions before you write them a loan. Commerce hates drama. Europe will feel the drag. And the cultural consequences. You can't burn a high-profile Grand Master in a capital city and expect people to forget. They don't. They retell the story. It grows horns and halos as needed. Some will make the Templars into saints in white, some into sinners in scarlet. Both are wrong and right. They were men. They did good. They made mistakes. They were useful. They became a problem for a monarch who didn't do nuance. They got dismantled by a church that chose order over argument. We'll drift next into the afterlives, the legal afterlife, the bowls and transfers, the institutional afterlife, the Order of Christ, the Hospitallers, and what people actually did with the Templars' farms and mills. The personal afterlife, former brothers becoming stewards, clerks, captains, and the occasional hermit, and the mythic afterlife. Freemasons will make a cameo, politely, because this is a bedtime story, not a convention. For now, let your breath slow. History has done what it does. An institution grew from an idea. It ran on routines and vows. It helped knit a continent together in ways no one fully appreciated at the time. It also annoyed the wrong king. The end came not with a battle, but with synchronized keys and a stack of sealed letters. The rest is ash and paperwork. We'll pick up the thread in part 3 and follow it without hurrying. Europe keeps moving. The men in white disappear, and then, in a quiet way, don't.
Welcome back. Lights low, breath steady. If you've dozed and woken and lost your place, that's all right. We're still here, moving at the speed of old paper and older stone. We've watched the order fall in France. Fires were lit, bowls were read, and an organization that began with 9 knights and a practical idea was dissolved with seals and ash. What comes after a public ending is usually much quieter. Lists, transfers, arguments in rooms that smell like wax and dust. Let's drift into that. When Pope Clement V suppressed the order in 1312, he did it with care to the legal furniture. Vox in excelso dissolved the Templars for the peace of the Church, which is medieval code for this has become unmanageable. Ad providum, a companion bull, directed that their goods, lands, rights, and movables should pass to the Hospital of St. John, the Hospitallers. The logic was blunt. Move resources from one military order to another, and keep them serving Christendom. On parchment, it's clean. On the ground, it was anything but. Templar property was not a pile of coins waiting on a table. It was estates that grew grain, vineyards that needed pruning, mills that turned water into flour, and knights into a hum. It was urban houses leased to merchants. It was rights to collect tolls on a bridge, and rights to take timber from a specific forest, and rights to run fairs that happened on certain saints' days when the weather was tolerable. You can't load that on a wagon. You inherit it like you inherit a farm cat, with obligations.
So the Hospitallers found themselves holding a bag full of tasks. In some places, they took possession quickly. In others, they ran into donors' descendants who said, "Actually, my great-grandfather gave that on condition of crusading, and there's no crusade now, so no." Local lords slipped fences at night and moved them a few yards. Tenants tested new rents the way a dog tests a new owner. Lawsuits bloomed like thistles. The hospital's Red Cross was about to learn what the Templars' Red Cross had learned. Prestige looks like a parade. Administration looks like Tuesday.
Different kingdoms handled the transfer differently. In France, royal officers had already warmed their hands at the Templars' hearth. The crown extracted expenses, because why not double down, and managed the handovers with a level of helpful supervision that would make a modern accountant politely cough. Some estates made it through to the Hospitallers. Others were carved up, temporarily attached to royal projects that tended to last longer than anyone intended. England took its time. Edward II had opened by saying he didn't believe the charges. He ended by cooperating, a phrase that covers a lot of resigned paperwork. Commissions investigated. Inventories grew. In the end, a great deal was transferred to the Hospitallers, who then leased parts of it to pay for the privilege of owning it. The most famous site, Temple in London, the round church and the precinct, went to the Hospitallers by right. But they were not Londoners by habit. They leased parts to lawyers, who turned the complex into what became the Inner Temple and Middle Temple. The chanting of offices was traded for the droning of legal arguments, which is a kind of liturgy if you squint. In Iberia, the transfer took more creative forms. The Crown of Aragon did not want to give everything to the Hospitallers. King James II, who was no fool about local interests, founded the Order of Montesa in 1317 specifically to take over former Templar estates in his territories. The Pope approved because practical solutions have a way of sounding pious when written in Latin. In Castile, some properties went to native orders like Calatrava in Santiago, long rooted in frontier warfare and land management. Portugal took the most elegant path. King Dinis, patient and pragmatic, created the Order of Christ in 1319 and steered Templar assets into it with papal blessing. It's a rebrand with purpose. Pins come off the old cloak, a new cross is stitched on. Many of the same men keep doing the same work, now with paperwork that offends the French king less. In the German lands and the Low Countries, patterns varied by bishop and burgrave. Some properties shifted to the Hospitallers, some were spirited into noble hands with that specific medieval talent for unexpected donation. A few went back to original donors' families with quiet nods. When your political map is a mosaic, your property map will be too. Meanwhile, in Italy, where city-states had always danced to their own music, Templar urban houses and farms became bargaining chips in communal politics. The Hospitallers negotiated because Italy demands it. Some houses went to confraternities, some to monasteries with better local standing. The result was a fine web instead of a straight line.
This was the institutional afterlife, complicated, slow, and full of people who needed to get through harvest season. The personal afterlife was gentler than you might think, depending on your latitude. In France, the trials had been sharp. Many brothers there were imprisoned, or in the case of those who recanted, killed. Elsewhere, a lot of men ended up doing what they were already good at, only with a different badge. The Hospitallers took in a number of former Templars, especially those with useful skills, marshals who knew horses, stewards who knew rents, chaplains who knew how to keep a house decent. Some joined other orders or went into clerical life. Some took pensions and lived quietly. A former knight could turn into a castle warden for a secular lord, and no one would be shocked. The skills translated. The cloak was the main thing that had become politically radioactive. There are little human moments scattered in the paperwork. A brother by the name of John who asks for a pension to be paid in wheat instead of coin because his local market is untrustworthy. A house servant who gets his freedom and a small plot because he stayed when others did not. A cartload of harness sold for half its value because the new owners needed cash more than they needed leather.
This is not the sound of a grand conspiracy. It's the sound of an economy absorbing a shock and then smoothing it over with mundane decisions. The Hospitallers, a word here for them, were not the same as the Templars. They began as a charitable hospital in Jerusalem and slowly took on more military roles as the 12th century wore on. They were already wealthy and organized. Getting Templar assets made them wealthier and more complicated. Within a decade of the Templar fall, the Hospitallers captured Rhodes, 1309, which pushed them strongly toward the sea. They became a naval order, a guardian of lanes and islands, a red cross on a black sail. That maritime turn might have happened anyway. Receiving scattered estates across Europe certainly helped pay for it. The transfer of knowledge, so much quieter than the transfer of land, worked without bulls. A steward taught his deputy how to keep 2 tallies on 1 page. A commander taught a younger man how to read a market 3 towns away by the way pack horses arrived at the gate. A clerk took his drafting habits to a bishop's chancery, and suddenly the bishop could find things. This was the Templars' real diaspora, men carrying methods in their heads and hands.
Let's float into a place where that method took on a new life with a very explicit label. Portugal's Order of Christ is as close as you can get to a sanctioned continuity without stating it out loud. King Dinis negotiated carefully with the papacy. The order's headquarters settled at Castro Marim, later at Tomar, a former Templar stronghold with a keep that looks like it grew out of the rock to watch the river forever. Brothers wore a red cross that wasn't the Templar cross. Their rule had familiar bones. Their estates were largely the same. Over the 14th and 15th centuries, the Order of Christ became a financial and administrative engine for Portuguese outward-looking projects. You'll see their cross on sales in the age of Henry the Navigator, Prince Henrique, who held the order's Grand Mastership. If you want a neat lineage line without the drama, this is it. A military monastic engine turned toward ships, charts, and winds. In the Crown of Aragon, the Order of Montesa took on a similar role, though its footprint and fame were smaller. It absorbed lands. It guarded frontiers. It learned to manage estates mindfully. It's not romantic. It is durable. Let's step back to the myths for a minute because they always walk in when a bonfire has been lit. Bannockburn, 1314, Scotland versus England. You'll hear sometimes that a band of Templars arrived on the field and turned the tide. It's a satisfying image, white mantles appearing like ghosts to help Robert the Bruce. The sources closest to the battle do not mention it. It's a later flourish, perhaps encouraged by the fact that Scotland was not keen on arresting Templars for the Pope's convenience. If you want a medieval rumor that goes down like warm milk, this is one. But it doesn't hold up under a candle. Rosslyn Chapel, 15th century, built by the St. Clair Sinclair family. It's a strange and lovely building with carvings that run the gamut from deeply Christian to, what is that plant doing on that capitol? You'll hear it's a Templar shrine. It is not. It is, however, a very good example of how craft knowledge and symbolic habits persist in a place where men trained by men who once worked for a military order now work for a noble patron with a taste for complex geometry. If you want a Templar ghost, think a mason's hand smoothing a curve the old way, not a secret vault under the floor. The Shroud of Turin appears in the 1350s in Lire, France, in the hands of a knight named Geoffroy de Charnay. You'll sometimes hear that he was a descendant of Geoffroy de Charnay, the Templar burned with de Molay. Different men, likely related in name and region, not necessarily by blood. The shroud ignites debate even then. Is it Christ's burial cloth, a devotional image, a clever painting? The church slides between pastoral accommodation and investigation. The Templar connection makes for a good story. The evidence is suggestive only if you like suggestion. If you want to sleep well, think of it as one more medieval object that meant many things to many people, and still does, which is one of the few constants across the centuries.
Baphomet, the supposed idol, the word likely mangled Mohammed, an old way of referring to the Prophet of Islam, said by people who enjoyed calling anything they disliked Saracen. Or perhaps it's a garble of some internal word that never made sense outside a room. Reliquary heads existed all over medieval Europe. Think silver faces holding a skull placed on an altar for veneration. If anyone saw one in a Templar chapel without context, it might look like a head being worshipped. That's not sinister. That's a normal reliquary having a bad PR day. The Friday the 13th thing, since it always knocks on the door, doesn't show up as a superstition at the time. It's a later association. The arrests happened on that date. People like patterns. They still do. The economic ripples are less cinematic than curses and more influential. Remove a big, trusted financial and logistical network and you create stress fractures. The Avignon papacy, seated on the Rhone, relies heavily on Italian bankers, especially Tuscan houses, to handle collections and transfers. Those bankers had already worked with or learned from the same techniques that made the Templars useful. In the 1320s and 1330s, houses like the Bardi and Peruzzi will expand and then crash for complicated reasons. Loans to kings who don't repay will do that. Is that because the Templars spell? Not directly, but the habit of monarchs treating great financiers as utilities rather than partners as a way of repeating itself after it's rewarded once. Meanwhile, the fabric of Europe keeps shrugging on whether it can't control. The Great Famine of 1315 through 1317 grinds bodies down. The 100 Years' War begins in 1337 and drains treasuries like a cracked cask. The Black Death arrives in 1347 and teaches cities the meaning of silence. Against that kind of noise, the fall of a military order becomes one thread among many. Its effects are woven into the larger pattern, hard to pick out unless you run your fingers along the grain very, very slowly. We can, if we like that sort of thing, map the Templar hierarchy so we know what roles were lost or redistributed. A Grand Master at the top, a Senestal as his right hand, a Marshal to handle horses and war, a Draper to keep clothing and kit, a Turcopolier in the east to manage native light cavalry, visitors who inspected provinces, commanders running local houses, chaplains for souls, sergeants for everything from fighting to carding to standing in doorways with an expression that said, "Please don't." It was a machine designed to take grain at one end and deliver armored men where needed at the other, with prayer braided into the middle. When the machine broke, its parts were reused. Marshals became stable masters for kings. Drapers became quartermasters in someone else's hall. Chaplains went to parishes that needed a firm hand and a calm voice.
A quick, slow stroll to Cyprus, where the order had regrouped after the fall of Acre. The Templars there did not survive the wave. The Hospitalitors did, and kept going, anchoring themselves in Rhodes and eventually Malta. Some surviving Templars in the East drifted into secular service for Lusignan kings or into the Hospitalitors' ranks, or, quietly, into merchant life. There are ship lists that make you think of a former brother teaching a young sailor how to feel wind on his teeth and know when to reef. If we follow the method rather than the mental, we reach Italy again and the rise of structured banking and double-entry bookkeeping. The Templars did not invent double entry, that's a 14th century Tuscan development, but their habit of record-keeping and paper instruments taught people to trust paper. And trust is the invisible ink behind every ledger. When later banks grew, they grew in fields the Templars had helped plow. And then there's the legal habit the French crown adopted from its successful strike. If you can win public opinion with a moral accusation and seize assets under cover of reform, you have a tempting tool. It would be unfair to blame every later suppression on Philip IV, but he did demonstrate that it could be done, and done profitably, if you didn't mind the long-term cost to institutional trust. Other rulers took notes. Back to people, because the story breathes better that way. A former Templar in England, gray-bearded and tired, sits in a small house near a town where he once supervised a grange. He tends herbs. He corrects a boy's Latin with 2 gentle taps on the knuckles. He wears plain clothes and a plain cross. He goes to church and kneels in a different stall. Sometimes a traveler calls him brother, and he looks surprised. and then grateful that someone remembers. In Aragon, a younger man in Montesa drills recruits who still want to believe that fighting can be a prayer. He shows them how to keep formation when a horse falls. He speaks softly. He reminds them that the worst thing you can do is drop your discipline in panic. It's obvious advice. It's also how institutions survive.
In Portugal, an officer of the Order of Christ drafts an inventory of rope, tar, biscuits, and spare sails. It is the least romantic list. It is also the material basis for crossing oceans without dying. He stamps the page with a seal. The impression is a cross, not the old one, a cousin of it. In London, a lawyer in the Temple reads a brief by candlelight and frowns at a sentence that could be clearer. He hears a faint echo in the round church where effigies of knights lie with crossed legs. They are not going anywhere. Neither are the arguments that will be spoken in rooms nearby for the next 700 years. And in Paris, there's a memory that refuses to go. A king died. A pope died. A Grand Master died in flames because he refused a script. That kind of refusal plants a seed in public memory. Even if everything else is muddy, that is clean. It doesn't make the order holy. It doesn't make the king uniquely evil. It just feels like the sort of moment where a human being stands upright, which is rarer in the record than we'd like. As for secret societies, the Freemasons will later adopt symbols that look medieval and sometimes medieval-ish. They will tell stories about Templars that are good company on an autumn evening with wine. Direct lineage? The evidence isn't there the way we'd like it to be. Indirect lineage, through craft guilds, their habits of geometry, through the reuse of spaces like the temple precinct, feels more plausible and more interesting. Real history likes roots that spread sideways. If you've been waiting for someone to pull a gold-laden wagon out of a cave, sorry. The treasure that mattered most was procedural. Systems are dull on the surface and exhilarating under a microscope. The Templars' gift to the future wasn't a chest. It was a way of doing things, calmly, reliably, in networks that made distances shorter and surprises fewer. You cannot seize that with soldiers. You pass it on by training and habit, which is exactly what happened. We'll let the Hospitallers sail on toward Rhodes. We'll let Montesa put up new banners on old walls. We'll let the Order of Christ learn to read the Atlantic. And we'll turn, gently, to the people who made this happen across generations. Clerks with good ink, stewards with clear eyes, officers who thought far ahead. In Part 4, we'll keep following this knowledge as it takes on new names and lives, quietly making Europe a little more coordinated than it realizes. For now, take another easy breath. The noise is settled. We're in the long tail of consequences, where the biggest changes are made by people who never raise their voices.
Welcome back. If your pillow has formed a perfect little nest, excellent. If your cat has claimed your shoulder as real estate, that's medieval too. House cats have been running Europe since green was invented. We left the Templars and their afterlives, men without mantles, methods without a name. The lands were transferred, the bulls were written, the fires were out. What remained, stubbornly, was habit, and habit travels better than gold. Let's keep the pace slow and follow the paperwork. Not the dramatic kind, the useful kind. Seals, ledgers, standardized forms. Any large organization has two secret weapons: routine and trust. The Templars had spent 2 centuries engineering both. You deposit at a house in Poitiers, you receive in Acre. You bring a note with a seal. It's not romantic, but neither is sleeping indoors. Value requires predictability. They were very good at predictability. When they vanish, Europe doesn't lose the idea of long-distance trust, it just relocates it. City-states pick up the slack. Italian bankers,
Tuscans especially, breathe life into letters of exchange and more systematic bookkeeping. It's tempting to say the Templars became the bankers. They didn't, but it's fair to say they helped teach Europe to trust paper and seals over a man on a horse with a bag of coins. Once you get used to not carrying your wealth in your belt, you don't want to go back. The bankers noticed. Let's drift to the Rhone, where the papacy sits in Avignon and discovers that distance is a mood and a math problem. The church needs to collect tithes across Christendom and route funds to a papal court that is now very French and very interested in not missing payroll. The Templars won't be doing the logistics. Italian houses will. The Bardi and the Peruzzi expand, handle papal transfers, and extend credit to kings with appetites. The arrangement is cozy until it isn't. When the English crown delays repayment in the 1340s, Edward III has a war, because of course he does. Those bankers collapse spectacularly. It's not a straight line from Templar suppression to Florentine bank failures, but you can see the family resemblance in how much faith institutions now put in paper promises and how much trouble starts when a large armed client develops opinions about repayment schedules.
Elsewhere, the Hospitallers patch together a navy from necessity. They take Rhodes by 1309-1310 and learn the wind the way a knight learns a horse. They become, with time, a coastal order, and later, from Malta, a maritime one. You can almost hear an old Templar marshal watching them rig a ship's line and mutter, approvingly, "Tidy." The Red Cross changes shape. The habits remain. They tend lepers. They chase corsairs. They lay in biscuit and shot. They are pragmatic. They have to be. Meanwhile, in Portugal, the Order of Christ, born in 1319 by papal bull and royal patience, grows into its new clothes. Its castles are familiar. Its rule is cousin to a rule we've already met. Over the 15th century, it becomes the financial spine for outward-looking projects. Prince Enrique, better known as Henry the Navigator, becomes its governor, administrator technically, in 1420. People love to imagine a school at Sagres, with maps on the wall and the smell of tar in the air. The school is probably a romantic compression of real things. Shipyards, pilots, charts, instruments, and a lot of trial and error folded into experience. Here's the part that matters. The cross on the sails, red, squared, unmistakable, is the Order of Christ's emblem. Not Templar strictly, but the continuity in practice is strong. The order budgets, stores, and staffs like a monastic machine that happens to love the sea. They learned wind patterns the way their predecessors once learned caravan schedules. They breed caravels like smart, restless fish. They build way stations, Madeira, the Azores, Cape Verde. Sugar plantations appear on islands that look like paradise and work like mills. That economic model, plantation agriculture tied to maritime logistics, will be exported, with all its dark consequences, to the Atlantic world. It's not the Templars' fault. It is one of those places where medieval method meets early modern scale. We can drift east and let our eyes find Venice on a gray morning. The Doge's palace looks like lace wrapped around power. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, all those city-states built a culture that admixes trade with patience. They learned to keep ledgers that notice winds and politics in the same column. When Crusader states fell, these merchants did not stop. They altered contracts and routes. They knew Mamluk officials by name. They negotiated with sultans while saying their prayers in Latin, then went home and argued about tariffs. If you're looking for where Templar habits found a natural home, maritime republics are not a bad address. You could say the Templar cross moved off horseback blankets and onto sailcloth with new logic and old discipline. The Teutonic Order deserves a calm mention. Not Templars, not Hospitallers. German, and very good at fortress building and frontier management. In Prussia and Livonia, they construct a network of brick castles that look like chess pieces placed to control rivers and grain. They do crusading in the Baltic the way Iberian orders did crusading in the Tagus Valley. Long, patient,
full of tables and storehouses and administrative minutes. They survive the 14th century with their charter intact, then run into Polish and Lithuanian realities at places like Grunwald or Tannenberg in 1410. Even then, for decades, they remain administrators whose routine could make a monk nod in approval. They're a reminder that medieval orders weren't just a Holy Land phenomenon. They were a medieval habit, combined vow, bureaucracy, and steel.
A gentle detour to the German church states, because it's easy to forget how political bishops had to be. Prince bishops didn't just swing incense, they collected tolls and garrisoned bridges. Some absorbed former Templars into their staffs without fanfare, not because of ideology, because competence is rare, and men who can count grain and keep horses alive in February are more valuable than a dozen pretty theories. In those offices, Templar habits of inspection and standardization lived on in the least dramatic way possible, as checklists. We'll soften the light and look at myths, again, because they're persistent little plants. The crossed legs on effigies. You'll see knights in stone with legs crossed at the ankles or the knee. A later rumor says that means they were crusaders. It makes for satisfying captions in cathedral brochures. It's not reliable. It's a style choice, or a sculptor's habit, or a sign of status. Real crusading leaves its mark in scars, not in marble ankles. Still, people point. People love the hint. Freemasonry, the 18th century fraternity with its own symbols and stories, will tell tales of Templar survival folded into lodge lore. That's not a smoking gun. It's a cultural aftertaste. If you asked a Mason in 1750 why Templars matter, he'd give you a speech about virtue under pressure and secrets kept with honor. He wouldn't produce a charter from 1312. The link is symbolic, not institutional. It remains, somehow, enough for many. And yes, the curse. We left Jacques de Molay in the flames and the story of his last words curling into the sky. The Pope and the King die within months in 1314. Philip's sons tumble off the dynastic ladder like tired actors. Exiting stage left, Louis X dies in 1616, Philip V in 22, Charles IV in 28. The main Capetian line ends. A scandal, back in 1314, Philip's 3 daughters-in-law, accused of adultery in the Tour de Nesle affair, doesn't help matters. 2 Aunay brothers are executed. The young women are punished in ways that make you want to walk very slowly around the 14th century and not touch anything. The succession crisis feeds into the tangled roots of the 100 Years' War. Does de Molay's curse explain any of this? No. It's a tidy thread sewn onto a frayed cloak, but I understand why it stuck. People like a moral invoice. Let's bring the focus down to small rooms. A chancellery in Florence. A clerk trims his pen, dips it in gall ink, and practices a hand so regular that you could set your heartbeat to it. He copies a list of correspondence and rates of exchange. The innovations that will make Florence bank famous, double-entry bookkeeping, reliable bills of exchange, are crystallizing in his lifetime. He doesn't think of the Templars. He thinks of accuracy. But accuracy has a genealogy, and part of it involves 2 centuries of men in white mantles who made it their job to reconcile what came in and what went out.
A port in Bruges. A Lombard banker in a fur-lined hood counts coin in a side room while a customs officer looks the other way. A letter of credit goes into a leather wallet. It bears a seal and a phrase in politely forceful Latin. The habits of trusting paper and seals survive because they are practical. You don't need romance when something is this useful. A hospice in Rhodes. A hospitaller surgeon, trained by repetition and by what we would now call trial data, ties off a bleeding artery and murmurs a prayer to St. John. The military orders learned a long time ago that caring for the sick was not sentimental. It was expensive, systematic, and, done properly, reputationally valuable. That blend of service and prestige, charity and brand, is medieval. It is also modern. You can draw a line from a ward in Rhodes to a hospital boardroom with a fundraising gala and not strain your wrist. In Portugal, the Order of Christ signs a contract that lists linen, salted fish, wine, pitch, spare masts, and religious items. It's an ordinary provisioning deal. In its ordinariness, you could feel a horizon opening. You stack barrels, and the world gets smaller. The order's administrator stamps the parchment. The wax takes the impression cleanly. He frowns at a crooked line. He's a man who would have gotten along with a Templar draper in 1200. In Scotland, a craft guild meets by candlelight. The master marks out a design on a tracing floor using compass and cord. He isn't a Templar. He never met one, but the geometry feels old because it is old. And the sequence of setting out a curve with offcuts of string has been handed down from someone who learned it from someone who learned it in a workshop that once mended harness near a commandery. That's how knowledge survives, by being too obvious to notice. Over in the Eastern Mediterranean, knowledge flows in less romantic directions than a novel would tolerate. Men switch sides. A Frankish engineer takes service with a Mamluk emir because wages don't ask you for your confession. He points out a weakness in a curtain wall design, the sort of thing you discover after standing under arrows for a decade. In return, he learns siege methods using counterweight trebuchets that European forces will adopt enthusiastically. Later, gunpowder drifts in from China via Islamic intermediaries. Europe receives it. The next century grows loud. Orders that once measured out courage in lengths of lance will learn to measure it in lengths of barrel. But that's a future story. For now, we're still inside walls built by hands that understood weight and time.
Let's talk about the legal habit the French crown normalized. If you brand an institution as harmful or heretical and seize its property for the common good, you're making a play that will look very tempting to future rulers. The script gets reused. In England, 2 centuries later, Henry VIII dissolves monasteries with a different vocabulary and the same appetite. The rhetoric shifts from heresy to reform. The end result looks familiar. Lands transferred, treasures catalogued, choir stalls emptied. In Spain, the Catholic monarchs centralized the masterships of military orders under the crown. In 1773, popes suppressed the Jesuits under pressure from Bourbon courts. Different eras, same theater. Philip IV didn't invent the tactic. He did make it feel doable. You can put a melancholy bookmark in the idea of direct papal orders here. The Templars had once enjoyed exemptions that made them float above local law. That sky got smaller in the 14th century. The Avignon papacy tethered popes to lay politics. The Great Schism later split papal authority into rival claimants. The notion that you can appeal to Rome against your king lost practical weight. In that narrower sky, orders like the Templars would have had trouble anyway. Institutions that don't bend often break. The ones that survive learn to bend in ways that look like bowing, but aren't. We should give a nod to what the Templars did badly, because bedtime stories still like honesty. They could be arrogant. Exemptions go to your head if you let them. They rubbed bishops the wrong way. They cut hard deals. They had the kind of institutional confidence that reads as virtue to supporters and as insolence to anyone who wants their barn back. None of this justifies a king's synchronized arrests. It does explain why some people didn't fight harder for them. No one needs to fake a scandal when there's a ready audience for one. And a quiet note on the initiations that cause so much ink and pain. Private rituals always make enemies twitchy. It's not that the Templars did anything particularly exotic by medieval standards. They didn't. Their vows looked like other vows. Their ceremonies looked like other ceremonies. But if you can't see a thing, you can project onto it. The order's success gave room for projection. The trials turned projection into proof. It's a script that keeps getting revived. Let's walk through a Templar house one last time after the suppression, as it passes to the Hospitallers. A steward opens a cabinet. He counts keys, heavy and polished by hands that are now somewhere else. The chapel smells of stone and candles and a permanent faint chill. The round church in London still echoes like a drum when you whisper. A new cross hangs over the altar. The old cross is gone, but if you look at the pattern of wear on the floor, the paths people took are still there. Institutions leave grooves in space. People keep walking in them, even when the sign over the door changes.
The most surprising part of this story is how unsurprising its ending is. No hidden fault, no surviving order steering history from a cave under a Scottish chapel. Just habits finding new hosts. People who knew how to do things doing them somewhere else. An old machine dismantled. Its parts snapped into place in other machines. That took the weight and kept moving. If you're still awake, a small scene as a nightcap. Paris, decades after the fires. A cobbler on the Quai de la Cité fits a shoe. He was a child when the Grand Master burned. He remembers a hush and heat, and the way adults looked at each other afterward. He doesn't know bulls by name. He knows prices by heart. He knows where the grain comes from, and which merchants are honest, and which procession will tie up the street on a Thursday. He knows the temple quarter for its markets and lawyers now. He knows the round church because he once hid behind a pew and fell asleep there. If you asked him about the Templars, he'd shrug. Then he'd tell you about a neighbor who keeps his word. That is the legacy that mattered. We'll keep floating in Part 5. There's more to watch as medieval habits flow into early modern patterns. Maps grow sharper, guns get louder, and institutions learn to dress new. We'll stay with the quiet lines, the ways administrations copy each other, how methods migrate without passports, and how a red cross on the sail can be both a new emblem and an old muscle memory. For now, let your eyes rest. Let the ledger close. The story keeps going without us for a few hours. It's good at that. Welcome back. If the room is quiet and your kettle's done its job, perfect. If your eyes are heavy, that's also on theme. We're still walking the slow path. No chase scenes, just soft footsteps through archives and old stone. Last time, we watched the Order end in public and survive in private. Habits passing from white mantles to new uniforms and plain clothes. Tonight, we'll follow those habits as they seep into the early modern world. The scenery changes, sails, cannons, counting houses, but the rhythm is familiar. Lists, ledgers, and people who keep promises on paper. Let's ease back to the Rhone, where the papal court settled in Avignon in the early 14th century. The popes there have bills to pay and a network to feed. Tithes come in from distant dioceses. Monasteries owe portions. Bishops send boxes and bills of exchange. The Templars used to do some of this connective tissue work. Now Italian bankers step in. Florentine houses, Bardi, Peruzzi, and later the Medici perfect the choreography. Letters of exchange settle debts without the drama of moving silver. Clerks standardize hands. Seals multiply like careful barn cats. For a while, it hums. And then, as happens when kings treat credit like a suggestion, the hum turns scratchy. Edward III of England borrows hugely in the 1330s for a war that will go on long enough to make bards tired. Repayments wobble, obligations tangle. Florentine giants topple in the 1340s, not because Templars disappeared, but because the new system now runs on trust and timing, and both are fragile under royal impatience. The lesson, paper is powerful and also painfully mortal, would have made an old Templar treasurer nod. He knew that feeling. Meanwhile, on Rhodes, the Hospitallers are building the world's least relaxing travel brochure. Crisp walls, strict inventory, reliable care. After taking the island in 1309–1310, they organize themselves into langs, linguistic nations that share responsibilities. It's tidy, which is half the job. Their hospitals aren't romantic, they're organized. Beds in rows, clean linens, broth, records. The military side is just as domestic when you look closely. Rope spliced, powder counted, sails mended. The red cross on black cloth moves across Aegean gray like a slow metronome. They fight, yes, but mostly they prepare.
Pick up a provisioning list for a hospital or convoy, and it reads like a poem about preparedness. Biscuit, salted meat, dried beans, wine, vinegar, oil, candles, spare rigging, canvas, tools for carpenters and smiths, surgeon's kit. It's not glamorous, but this is the layer of life that keeps ships afloat and men breathing. If you hear an echo of an older order's draper counting tunics and tack, you're not imagining it. Now drift to Portugal, where the Order of Christ, founded in 1319 with papal blessings and royal patience, grows into the role of quiet quartermaster for a country suddenly in love with horizons. By the 1420s, Prince Henry the Navigator, is administering the order. He isn't a professor at a school of Sagres with a chalkboard and an attendance sheet. He is something more practical, a patron who pays for pilots, shipwrights, charts, and the long, slow learning of wind. The order's cross, red, squared, goes up on sails. The ships are small and clever. The Volta do Mar, the turn of the sea, becomes a mental map. Don't fight the wind head-on. Ride the big gyres that look wrong on flat maps, but right in practice. It's a worldview disguised as a sailing tip. Step into a storehouse at Lagos or Lisbon in the 1440s. Barrels stacked, coils of rope like sleeping serpents, new navigational toys, astrolabes hammered into shape by hands that also mend spoons. The order pays for it, the crown smiles, merchants take notes. The islands of Madeira and the Azores sprout warehouses and chapels. Sugar follows, then the system that will move it to other oceans with consequences too heavy for a lullaby. The Templars did not cause any of this, but the method, steady provisioning, standardized accountability, a network you can trust, helps it scale. Turn north and inland. In the German lands, the Teutonic Order keeps marching to its own brick-built drum. Not Templars, not Hospitallers, but absolutely part of the family of military bureaucratic organisms. In Prussia and Livonia, they line rivers with castles that look like red chess pieces after a patient game. Their chronicles are heavy on accounts. So many bushels, so many men, weather uncooperative. They trade in grain and fish and iron discipline. In 1410 at Grunwald, Tannenberg, they experience a large and decisive no, delivered by Polish-Lithuanian forces. After that, they adjust, like any institution that wants to keep its lights on. They remain very good at counting. We should check in on the French habit of turning moral accusation into policy, because it doesn't go away. Philip IV showed how to do it. Later kings take notes. It's not just France either. In Spain, the Catholic monarchs fold the masterships of native military orders into the crown's hands piece by piece, bringing Calatrava, Alcantara, and Santiago under royal control. In 1523, Pope Adrian VI grants perpetual administration of those masterships to Charles I, Emperor Charles V. It's tidy if you're the crown, less tidy if you're a master who used to enjoy some independence. The rhetoric is reform and unity. The effect is centralization. You can almost hear a Templar in 1307 mutter, "We've seen this movie."
England's 16th century turn is the loudest echo. Henry VIII dissolves monasteries in the 1530s with bureaucratic vigor and a marketing campaign about purity and efficiency. Royal commissioners tour, list, assess, seize. Choir stalls empty, treasures are tallied, lands are sold to new men with cash and appetite. The language is reform. The mechanism is familiar. Name a target as burdensome, claim moral high ground, harvest property for the state. It's not a straight inheritance from Philip IV, but it's kin. And like most family traits, it shows up at inconvenient times. Across the Mediterranean, patterns of knowledge keep crossing borders with the stubbornness of salt. Engineers move between employers. A Frankish mason explains counterforts to a Mamluk patron who was less interested in his creed than his competence. Gunpowder artillery creeps into sieges, changing the silhouette of walls. Bastion Trace Italianic designs turn sharp corners into low, thick angles. The Hospitallers learn the new geometry. So do their enemies. It's not romantic. It's practical. If you can picture a Templar marshal measuring intervals between stakes, then squint, you can see why a 16th century master of fortifications sounds familiar. The same love of angles and schedules in a different idiom. Let's bring the lantern closer to one archive, because sometimes a single parchment shifts the temperature of a story. In 2001, a Vatican archivist, Barbara Frawley, announced the rediscovery of the so-called Chinon parchment, minutes from 1308 showing that Clement V's commissioners had interviewed top Templar leaders and, crucially, absolved them of heresy in secret. The full dossier, Processus contra Templarios, was later published in facsimile. It doesn't undo what happened. It does remind us that the papal machine tried, quietly, to nuance a steamroller. That's very on brand for the medieval church, a public stance and a private record that doesn't quite match, tucked away in a cupboard, waiting for a patient person with white gloves to turn a key. If you like memory that refuses to die, Paris will oblige. The Temple, the Templars' great complex, survived their fall. It became royal property, then a useful vault for things kings like to keep. During the French Revolution, the Temple Tower housed the royal family before their end. A place built to guard treasure ended up guarding people until neither treasure nor people were safe. The tower was demolished in the early 19th century, a tidy forgetting. But the neighborhood kept the name. You can still walk there and hear, under the city noise, the hush of many vanished rooms. In London, the Temple Church never stopped being itself. The round nave still echoes. Effigies still rest with varying degrees of accuracy in armor. The complex became the home of lawyers, the Inner and Middle Temple, after the Hospitallers leased it out. A place once built to house an order that answered to the Pope now houses a profession that answers to precedent. Different prayers, similar devotion to language.
Elsewhere, you can follow the word temple like breadcrumbs across maps. Temple Brewer in Lincolnshire, the village of Temple in Midlothian, once Belantradock, scattered Templestowe and Templehof and Temple names that remind locals of who once collected rents and brewed beer. They are not smoking guns so much as gentle pointers. When a word sticks, it's because an institution made enough of a groove in the place that people find it hard to rename the road. We'll let literature stroll in quietly. In the early 19th century, Walter Topsy plants a Templar villain in Ivanhoe, Brian de Bois Guilbert, all burnished pride and poor life choices. It's not history, it is influence. Scott's romantic medievalism sends readers back to churches and castles with new eyes, if not better footnotes. Later, in the 20th century, Umberto Eco will write Foucault's Pendulum, a very patient parody of the human need to connect everything. In the 21st, Dan Brown will make the Templars and their supposed mysteries a summer read. Fiction isn't evidence, it is how most people meet the past. If you keep that in mind, it's harmless. If you don't, it's how a reliquary head becomes an idol with a name and a cult it never had. As for Freemasonry, the fraternity will develop Templar-themed degrees in the 18th century and after, because chivalry sells and because the image of a persecuted, virtuous order makes a fine mirror for men who enjoy secrets that don't hurt anyone. There's no institutional lineage to 1312 you can lay on a table. There is a symbolic lineage that lets later people play at being faithful under pressure. It's role play with good intentions. That's allowed. We should talk about the little day-to-day bridges because they're almost always the most durable.
A notary in Valencia writing "in the year of our Lord" and then ticking off rents with tiny crosses. A steward in Languedoc showing a successor how to run a harvest account cleanly so you don't lose track of carts. A pilot in Lisbon teaching a younger man a rhyme that remembers stars. A hospitaller brother in Rhodes reminding a new orderly that a clean bandage saves more lives than a noble slogan. These aren't myths, they're skills, and skills get inherited sideways as often as they do straight down. If we want to be fair, we can also list what didn't carry forward. The Templar insistence on answering only to the Pope does not survive the century. The papal monarchy's reach shrinks and then splits in the Great Schism, 1378 to 1417. The Council of Constance patches it. The idea that any order can defy local authority with a tidy bull becomes more fantasy than policy. Kings collect more power. Cities grow teeth. Exemptions look like temptations to centralizers.
And some habits age out. Crusading as an ideal loses its hold, or relocates to Iberia and the seas. Warfare changes shape. Plate armor glows and then becomes heavy, and then becomes decorative, while artillery asks walls to rethink their geometry. Monastic military life doesn't vanish, it adapts. The Hospitallers are still around in Malta in the 16th century, still writing lists. The Teutonic Order becomes a more spiritual body after Prussian defeats and secularizations. Iberian orders become noble badges under royal control, and the Templar name goes into a chest labeled memory, pulled out by writers more often than by administrators. We've been careful with treasure, and will stay that way. No caves, no chests under a chapel floor that clink when you step. The wealth that mattered most went into the bloodstream of Europe's institutions, ways to write, count, schedule, and move. When you say we'll send the money and trust that it will arrive, you're living in the world that habits like the Templars helped make. When you walk into a hospital whose corridors smell faintly of soap and organization, you're in a world those habits prepared. Not because a Templar ghost is running procurement, because once you teach a society that systems can be trusted, you cannot unteach it without a fight. One last slow scene on Malta in the 16th century, because it's an afterimage with a familiar feel. The Hospitallers build low, angled walls, anticipate cannonballs, and store powder deep. They map water cisterns meticulously. They coordinate languages and lords. When war comes, as it always does eventually in the Mediterranean, it comes loud. We will not linger on it. The bureaucracy behind that defense is the real point. Ledgers and assignments, warehouses and ward lists. You could swap the red 8-pointed cross for a red cross pâté, and the work would look the same. And back in Paris, take a quiet evening walk to the former Temple neighborhood, long after towers fell. Cafes, apartments, a market stall selling fruit that would have stunned a medieval palate. Under it all, a footprint. A wall that once turned here, a road that once ran straight there because a cloister demanded it. Cities remember, even when they're pretending to forget. That's comforting. It means the grooves we make matter. Even when the signs change, the walk is familiar. If you're still awake, nice work. You've walked 5 parts of a story that refuses to end the way anyone plans. Founded as a small, earnest idea, grown into a network, unmade by a king who disliked rivals, and then, quietly, passed along as a set of methods hiding in plain sight. In Part 6, we'll keep the pace and follow a few last threads. How 15th century courts codified what once was practice, how archives tell on everyone eventually, and how the Templars' reputation became a mirror people hold up to whatever century they live in. Same lamp, same call and voice, no cliffhangers, only gentle corners. For now, let your shoulders drop. The ledgers can close, the keys can hang on their hooks. The past is good at keeping. We can trust it to wait until morning.